But I just want to say something about Joe Rogan's use, in quotation marks, as it were, of the N-word. I'm not going to say the N-word on your, distinguished program, but I should be able to say it. It's just a word. I'm talking about a word. I'm not talking about a slur. And neither was Joe Rogan's use of it a slur. He wasn't pointing to a person and calling them an N-I-G-G-E-R in a way of being a derogation, of an insult. He was speaking about speaking.
Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Freddie Sayers. Our guest today I am really excited about. We've been hoping to talk to him for some time. His name is Glenn Loury and he joins us from the US. Hi, Glenn.
Hello, Freddie.
Let me give an introduction to the, I suspect, minority of viewers that don't know anything about you. You were one of the very first African-American professors at Harvard. I believe you were the first tenured professor of economics there. You're currently at Brown University in the social sciences department. And for the purposes of this conversation, you're one of the premier and most eloquent explainers to the world of the vexed question of race. And you seem to have a way of calming things down and talking through them more rationally. Does that sound like a fair introduction?
It's very flattering, and I thank you for it.
So I want to do a bit of around the houses with you, if that's okay, Glenn. There seems to be a new race-related news story about every 2 or 3 days at the moment, and I just want to cover 2 or 3 of them with you. So first of all, this question of the US Supreme Court nominee. It's been going on for more than a week, and the president is now due to show his early selections. But what is different is that he has pre-announced that his nominee for Supreme Court Justice will be a black woman. This was a campaign pledge, and he is now overtly saying this before having begun the selection process. To outside observers, that seems strange. How should we think about it?
I think it is strange. I think no one needs to be apologetic about reacting to that announcement with a bemusement and a kind of quizzical, what? This comes out of Joe Biden's political ambition and the character of American politics. During the South Carolina primary, when Biden was uncertain of prevailing in the contest for the nomination of the Democratic Party in 2020, he wanted to appeal to the black vote. And so he made this announcement. He announced that his vice presidential selection would be a woman, and that his first appointment to the Supreme Court, should he be fortunate enough to have one, would be a black woman. You could call this craven pandering, if you like. I'm bemused by it because it unnecessarily raises questions about the fitness of whomever he might appoint to the court, having announced that I'm not considering anyone with black women, when he might have simply chosen a black woman as his nominee and crowed about it after the fact, and not have cast any doubt over the choice that he would have made. He could have said, this is the best, most qualified person that I could find. That might have been disputed. But in any case, as he's done it now, he's limited his range of options to a very small percentage of the total population of people who might have been selected. And you could say has put an asterisk by the name of whomever it is that he might ultimately select. But of course, there will be a very predictable debate here, castigating anyone who makes the observation that I just made. Your appointment has an asterisk because you announced in advance that you were restricting your attention to a small sliver of the total population of potential appointees. Castigating anyone who makes that observation as being a racist, because they will say, how dare you suggest that the best qualified person for the Supreme Court could not be a black woman? I didn't say any such thing. However, all I said was black women constitute a small percentage of the total population of persons who might be chosen, and to announce in advance that you're only going to consider them is to place the person ultimately chosen in the position of having doubts raised about her qualifications. Let me note, by the way, that the Biden administration has also rescinded the practice of appealing to the American Bar Association for assessment of the fitness of its judicial appointments. This had been a tradition for many, many years. The ABA would announce that a candidate was highly qualified, or less than highly qualified for the job. And they don't want that vetting from the outside and independent, and by the way, left-leaning American Bar Association, because they want the liberty to make whatever appointment they make without professional commentary on the fitness of their appointment. This is, by the way, the Supreme Court of the United States of America. This is the final stopping point for any legal dispute. There are 9 justices serving there. The quality of an appointment is not a small matter. We're not now admitting a marginal student to an elite college campus. We're selecting the people who are going to govern the country.
I think what people who take a different view might say at this point is, first of all, it's not the first time. When I expressed surprise, people kept sending me examples of previous presidents who have made a promise to select, first of all, a woman. I believe Ronald Reagan even made that suggestion or commitment, and President Obama was keen to nominate a Hispanic person to the Supreme Court, which he did with Sonia Sotomayor. So I just wonder, is it new? Do you think something new has happened, or is this just the continuation of a development?
Nothing qualitatively new. It's another, if you will, slide down the slippery slope. That would be one way of looking at it. But no, it's not totally new. No.
I guess what
that doesn't make it all right.
Right. So what felt new, at least to me, because I actually saw it on an Instagram post from the White House where he was there meeting with his vice president and members of the Senate to discuss potential options. And the caption read, he has committed to choosing a black woman. So there was this sort of disconnect. It felt like he was saying the quiet part out loud. And that felt new. Do you think there's something in that, that even if we sort of accept that these kind of considerations might be going on in the background, to put it out there in advance somehow breaks the meritocratic idea?
Doing it would have probably led to some speculation. Oh, I see, he's playing affirmative action with the Supreme Court. But it would have left open the possibility that he wasn't doing so. Saying in advance that he's going to do it leaves no doubt about it. My appointment as professor of economics at Harvard, which happened in 1982, was accompanied by an initiative at Harvard to enhance the quality of the Afro-American Studies department there. I was jointly appointed economics and Afro-American Studies. I was 33 years old. It would have been entirely fair for some outside observer looking on that scene to say, oh, well, fine. But if he hadn't been black, they wouldn't have appointed him. That's probably true. So such is the condition that we find ourselves in. And I mean, I could make myself into a martyr and bemoan the fact that my outstanding intellectual gifts would not be entirely properly valued in the marketplace because I'm black and they wanted a black person, and so on and so on and so forth. But that would be kind of small for me to do it. There may be some truth in it, but the fact of the matter is I had tremendous opportunities. I've tried to make the best of them.
What we're getting to then on this question of affirmative action, is it that some degree of affirmative action is acceptable and maybe a good idea to correct heinous sort of distortions in the composition of these kind of bodies, but it needs to be done in the background and with more sensitivity, and somehow it's got too far?
I would take the position that the U.S. Constitution does not bar the use of race as a factor in making selections of this sort. Some people hold that the Constitution unequivocally prohibits affirmative action, that it is in effect racial discrimination, and the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment forbids it. I don't take that view, but I think how you do it matters a lot. I think the extent to which you do it matters a lot. So if a university says, if we don't do anything, only 3% of our students will be black, and that's just unacceptable in a country where blacks are 13% of the population, I'd say fine. But if in so doing, they decide that they have to mirror the population percentages and that the student body has to be 12 or 13% Black if that's the proportions in the population. And in so doing, that last 5, 6% are students who are not really qualified to do the work at a selective institution. That's a very bad idea. It's a bad idea for the students. It's a bad idea for the society, in my opinion. It waters down standards. It's a very anti-meritocratic. It's a bad idea. They could have settled on 8% or 10% as opposed to 12 or 13%, and that would be a prudent measure. Likewise, in the case of the Supreme Court appointment, the president might have engaged in a kind of subtle and tacit preference rather than making a crowing about it and making it a overt and explicit. It sows a kind of contempt for the standards that we ought to be employing to, and so on. So I think there are ways of doing affirmative action that are more defensible and more prudent than others. And I think these things change over time. I mean, we are in the year 2022, a half century past the civil rights era. We're far, far into this regime of special treatment of Blacks because of the history of racism. We have to ask ourselves whether that's how here in the United States we want to live in an ongoing way.
Do you think there's this kind of confusion around the question of representativeness as well? That if you take it to the nth degree, that everything must try to be perfectly representative, you end up in a strange world. And with a body of 9 people, that's going to be difficult to achieve. I mean, which kind of public bodies, you mentioned student bodies in universities there, where you might have some consideration as to whether they are slightly representative of the population. Which bodies do you think should be representative? Should we try to do that?
I think it's a very good question. And what do we mean by representativeness? And who can represent whom? These are good questions. How many Catholics are there on the U.S. Supreme Court? We could enumerate them. I'm pretty sure there are more Catholics on the court in proportion than there are Catholics in the population. How many Jews? Dare we ask the question? How about gays, openly gay people? None on the Supreme Court? How dare we? Etc. That's a rabbit hole that we don't really want to go down. And it's kind of silly because it presupposes that something as superficial as racial identity or sexual orientation is of such fundamental significance that legal counsels must have members present who, when they act out in that context, are acting on behalf of, quote unquote, their group. Well, these individuals are not only women or Blacks or gays or Catholics. These are human beings whose humanity supersedes and reaches beyond the categories that we might impose on them. So I worry about this deeply. People say you must have a Black member of the congressional district because 30% or 60% of the voters there are Black. We trivialize the act of political representation when we reduce the constituents to their demographic category, and when we stipulate that the person representing them has to belong to the category before he can or she properly represent their interests. That's a very narrow-minded vision of political representation.
You mentioned there the question of Jews and Jewish representation, and I thought I would use that as a leaping off point to talk briefly about this Whoopi Goldberg controversy that has also happened in the last week, because, you know, these things come about once every 3 days at this pace. And my understanding is she was there on The View and they were discussing a movie that relates to the Holocaust, and she then said the Holocaust is not about race. How do you think Whoopi got to the point where she felt the Holocaust was not about race?
Well, I assume it's because she thinks Jews are white and she sees the European early mid-20th century context, which gave rise to the Holocaust, as an intra, quote, white, close quote, matter. I assume. I don't know in the interior of Whoopi Goldberg's thinking, but I think it's something like that. And I would chalk that up to ignorance and naivete. I mean, just not being immersed in the long history of modern Europe and anti-Semitism and the ideology of Nazism, in which the notion of, quote, race, close quote, had a very particular meaning. And I think Whoopi just didn't appreciate the actual meaning of the word race in the context in which the Holocaust arose. Revealing her ignorance. I mean, she ought not to have put it that way. It is a misstatement or a mischaracterization to say that the Holocaust was not about race. It just wasn't about, quote, race, close quote, in the way in which we in the United States might be talking about race.
It feels like it does speak to something wider that has happened, though, which is a kind of simplification of this question of race and these controversies, and a focus maybe to the exclusion of other sort of fractures on black-white race relations as the sort of what race really means. Do you think that's true? That somehow there is a sort of myopia almost. There's a single-mindedness about some forms of race difficulty where others get kind of left behind.
I absolutely think it's true. And by the way, it applies on the other side of the line. Blacks, quote unquote, here in the United States, people who would be classified as black, are not a homogeneous population. We have an increasing number, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, in the United Kingdom, of immigrants from West Africa who are making their way. They're black by any notion, but they're not in any way in the same cultural, economic circumstance as are the, if you will, native-born American black population who descend from slaves. So
arguably, the Jews in particular are now considered not a minority that needs defending.
It is true that Jews have prospered here in the United States on the whole, in terms of education, occupational status, income and wealth. Jews are doing well in terms of influence on the political life, presence in the media and in the academy and in the finance and so on. Jews are, quote, overrepresented, close quote. So a person might think, oh, Jews are doing just fine. But again, ask many Jewish people who are concerned about anti-Semitism, which one finds not only on the far right, Jews will not replace us kind of sentiments, but which one finds also in ethnic minority communities, especially amongst African Americans. There's quite a bit of anti-Semitism. There are attacks on Jewish interests. The Reverend Al Sharpton, a prominent civil rights leader, got his start in part by demagoguery over incidents in which there was conflict between blacks and Jews, whether that was in Bensonhurst or Crown Heights in Brooklyn, or whether it was in Harlem, where he led protests against a Jewish shopkeeper, et cetera. I don't mean simply to single him out, only to point out that he's a prominent and well-respected spokesman for African-American interest, and that he has a history in which I think anti-Semitism would be a fair descriptor to apply to some of his actions and statements. But I give that as one example, if I were a Jewish person, of something that I would want to attend to.
So the call there is just for a little bit more nuance, a little bit more understanding of the race issue isn't quite as kind of binary as people make it out, I guess. Is that how we make this better, do you think?
I'd like to tone down the emphasis on race and be more concerned about the humanity of people. If we wanted to talk about disadvantage, poverty, and the lack of wealth in America, there are more poor and low wealth-holding white people. They are, after all, a substantial majority of the population than there are black people. And anything worth doing, whether it be reform of education or changes in the tax laws or extension of the welfare state programs, et cetera, anything worth doing to help black people is worth doing to help people who are in need of help. I would have our arguments, that is our African-American arguments, couched in broad humanistic terms. And I think that less attention to racial identity and more attention to human common need is healthy for the country.
The kind of million-dollar question there is, does it actually make it worse? Is there a scenario in which too much emphasis on race alienates people such as the people you just talked about, maybe people in the poorer parts of the white community, or brings the issue back to the surface in a way that hadn't been true in previous years? Are you worried that, essentially elite progressives with virtuous intent are accidentally making the issue worse?
You put that very, very well. Actually, I've been arguing this about the police violence question. So George Floyd is killed, murdered. A jury has spoken by Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis in 2020. A policeman inappropriately applying force. He had his knee on the man's neck. The man expires. Was that a racial incident? Now, the police officer was white. The man who was killed, George Floyd, was black. It became a racial incident. A whole movement was launched or abetted by the racial characterization of that incident. But why should we understand it as a racial incident? I am willing to ask. Very little evidence at all, if any, that Chauvin, the police officer, was motivated by racial animus when he acted inappropriately. And on the victim's side, George Floyd, the fact that a policeman might use his power and harm a citizen, that's something that happens to white people too. There are cases parallel to the George Floyd case in which the victim has been white, which have not occasioned national attention. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I would say is that by cultivating a practice of looking at such incidents in racial terms invites a parallel practice of looking at criminal victimization of citizens in racial terms. You want to count the number of white cops who have killed unarmed black men? Somebody's going to start counting the number of black murderers who have abused black carjackers, who have robbed and threatened black assaulters, who have bludgeoned and beaten white people. There are an endless number of such cases. There is enough racial blame to go around. And I'd hate to live in a country in which when a white person was victimized by a black criminal, the first words out of their mouth was, "A black criminal victimized me." That's not good for black people because there are many black criminals. And that's not good for our country because the issue is a criminal victimizing a person. The criminal's blackness doesn't stand in for his race. He doesn't represent his race when he acts badly. The victim's whiteness doesn't stand in for her race. She doesn't represent her race when she seeks redress. Likewise, for police officers who act badly, if they're white, they're not representing whiteness. And if the victim is black, he's not representing blackness.
It doesn't feel like you're winning the argument overall. I mean, we literally are just talking about the president who has just announced his selection for the most important job he's going to fill on the basis of race first. So do you think that you are winning? Do you think this is a very serious situation that's getting worse? How worried should we be, and how bad could it get? Or do you think maybe sanity will prevail in the end?
No, I think we're in deep doo-doo, as George Herbert Walker Bush famously once said about something I don't remember what. We are in deep doo-doo. This is not going to be, I don't know that it ends well. I really don't. So the Supreme Court is going to rule on a lawsuit in which Asian American students are suing Harvard University, a private university, and the University of North Carolina, a public university, alleging that these institutions' use of racial preferences in the admissions policy is discriminatory against Asians who are underrepresented. If you were to admit only based on academic qualifications, you would have twice as many or 3 times as many Asians at these institutions as you now have, they allege, and so they sue. The Supreme Court is going to rule. The Supreme Court has 6 conservative justices, the majority of whom have publicly stated that they have serious doubts about affirmative action, about the constitutionality of affirmative action. Now, I've already given my position here that I think the 14th Amendment does not forbid the use of racial preferences, but I'm not a lawyer and I'm not on the Supreme Court. There's a very good chance that racial affirmative action will be stricken by the Supreme Court. If it happens, I assure you, there will be mobs in the streets of this country. No one is going to take, no progressive activist is going to take the Supreme Court's ruling as an opportunity to turn within and to consider, if we want to be at Harvard or the University of North Carolina in larger numbers, why don't we get busy preparing our youngsters from the cradle to be competitive in this great country that we live in, where competition is the coin of the realm? No, they're not going to do that. They're going to interpret that as an anti-Black move by a racist Supreme Court. I assure you, that is a disaster, and I think we're headed toward it.
Why is there not more sympathy for the Asian community among these progressive activists? I don't understand it. Why does a minority that maybe powerful institutions are suppressing not provoke more sympathy?
The Asians are called a model minority. People say that sardonically. You point to Asian success, and it's reflected back, they're a model minority. And of course, the subtle implication there is that you must be anti-Black. If you compare Blacks to Asians and you find the Blacks wanting, or anti-Latino, you see, you put them forward as a model minority. I think there's also doubts about meritocracy. I mean, I think, again, I'm not a contemporary intellectual historian, but I'll just step out on this limb, that some of the corruption and decadence of the legacy population here, Black and white, in American society, is exposed by Asian success. They expose the lack of depth and seriousness of too many of our people by their assiduous self-application and their excellence in the mastery of the currency of the modern world. I'm talking about calculus. I'm talking about biochemistry, et cetera.
So it's actually, it's sort of nativism. In a sense, it's
yes. Now, this Asian population, they're not foreign-born people on the whole that we're talking about here. These are Americans that we're talking about, but there's a cultural difference. People want to get rid of the test. I mean, think about that for a minute. They want to ban the assessment instrument to measure the intellectual achievement of people who are applying to scarce, prestigious, elite positions of intellectual work. They want to ban it. Why? Because the Asians are, in effect, because the Asians are doing too well, exposing, as I say, the laggardliness and unfitness of too many of our people, whatever their color might be.
I'm going to go to the last of our topics, if I may, Glenn, which is this question of the super podcaster Joe Rogan, who, as we know, in the past week or so, there's been a big, powerful movement to get removed from Spotify, to get him cancelled. The original transgression was inviting on people who were skeptical about vaccines, and he was not adequately, oppositional to their views or whatever. That was his first crime. It appears that that wasn't enough to get him removed from the platform, and somebody has now uncovered earlier historic instances of him using the N-word. I believe all of the instances he used them were in quotes, or they were referencing something else. He wasn't actually just using it. But what should we make of that, do you think?
Well, first of all, Joe Rogan has a $100 million deal with Spotify. I repeat, that's 9 figures, 100,000,000, 000. Who are those people who listen to Joe Rogan? They are mostly not latte sipping, national public radio listening, coastal elites in New York City or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or whatever. They are mostly, or more often than not, male, more often than not white. There's some truck drivers among them. There's some Trump voters among them. So this culture war that's well advanced here in the United States, in which we are in effect mutually contemptuous of one another based upon what camp we belong in. Joe Rogan is right at the center of it, and his audience substantially is on the quote wrong side from a progressive's point of view. A lot of this enmity directed toward Rogan is really directed toward his audience.
I'd love to see the internal statistics from Spotify. My bet would be that the number of coastal elites tuning into Joe Rogan is surprisingly high and probably just jumped a whole lot in the last week or so.
Well, that may be true, and I don't know what Spotify is going to let us know, but I agree. I'd love to know about that. But I just want to say something about Joe Rogan's use, in quotation marks, as it were, of the N-word. I'm not going to say the N-word on your, distinguished program, but I should be able to say it. It's just a word. I'm talking about a word. I'm not talking about a slur, and neither was Joe Rogan's use of it a slur. He wasn't pointing to a person and calling them an Nigger in a way of being a derogation, of an insult. He was speaking about speaking. That is to say, he was saying that the word exists, and then he was saying the word in the context of quoting someone else's use of it or whatever. We have we have a genre here of music, and it's called hip hop or rap, in which the word is used regularly by people who refer to themselves and others as Niggers, etc. And they are not using it as a slur either. It's a part of the English language. Now, this thing that we're doing here, where we're making the utterance of certain sounds an indication of a person's racism, and then seeking to cancel people for it being revealed that they uttered sounds not without any reference to their intent, is a bizarre phenomenon. And I think that it's actually not a sign of strength by the people, Black people, who insist that the sound of the word is so injurious to them. I think it's a sign of their weakness. There's something almost pathetic about requiring people to indulge you by not making certain sounds with their mouth, because hearing it reminds you of lynching, of night riders coming down on Black people and who are defenseless and are being set upon and whatnot. It reminds you of a history of oppression, and you can't use the word. They're now trying to ban the use of the word Negro with a capital N, Negro. This is a subsidiary development in this N-word banning process, because people don't like the sound of that word either, when that word for almost a century was a commonplace reference to African American. You'd have to expunge pretty much every book that refers to anything in terms of race in American society from 1890 until 1990 to get rid of the word Negro. And there are people who are trying to prevent others from using it. And this is a bizarre exhibition of their weakness.
Those people are not majority African American or Black, it appears to me at least. It seems like a lot of the voices getting most upset about this are white. And it seems more of a kind of elite, intra-elite power battle to do with the nature of the media, in which this race issue is just a handy battering ram.
That's an interesting observation. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but you well may be right. It is a part of the vocabulary of virtue signaling for elite whites to take their stand against the N-word and anyone else's utterance of it. It's another way that they can show that they're on the right side of history, entirely divorced both from reality and from whatever might be the actual interest of African Americans.
Do you think they'll win on this Joe Rogan issue? Do you think that those forces will prevail?
No, I don't, frankly, because I think Rogan has an audience, and I think even if Spotify were to deny him a platform, we live in a new technological age now. UnHerd is on the scene. Substack is on the scene. People don't require legacy media platforms in order to be able to get their voices heard. Joe Rogan is Joe Rogan. He's going to keep on being Joe Rogan.
So if we want to end on a little bit more of a hopeful note, maybe you just struck it there, which is that some of these battles are beginning to seem quite transparently cynical, and some of the logic is not there, and everyone can see that. And maybe this is actually the kind of last gasps of a way of thinking that is in recession. And that with these new forces, you know, you and I are having this conversation, it feels like you can speak freely. Maybe we should be hopeful that these tortured ways of thinking won't prevail. Well,
Freddie, I hope you're right. And what I know, I don't know if you're right or not, but what I do know is that I am not going to shut up.
Well, it's excellent to hear. And I hope you'll come on the show again and talk to us some more.
Thank you very much, Freddie, for having me. And I hope we can talk again soon.
That was Glenn Loury, professor, author, commentator, explainer, helping us to understand and navigate some of the choppier waters of race and race relations in the United States. He was forthright, as always, and told us there that he plans not to shut up and to carry on speaking his mind, and certainly we hope he does. Thanks to him for joining, and thank you to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.